And what was important about the first women who were ordained as rabbis is the way in which that opened up that there's not one monolithic view of what a rabbi is. And we are really focused on welcoming, embracing, supporting a wide range of students and everyone's glorious diversity and everyone's fullness of their identities.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore what religion sounds like with women's voices turned up. I'm your host, Pamela Prickett. Today, I'm joined by Rabbi Dr. Andrea Weiss. She is a biblical scholar and co-editor of an award-winning volume titled The Torah, A Woman's Commentary. She also recently organized a national bipartisan campaign that invites religious scholars to send letters to politicians in our nation's capital. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Weiss. We're honored to have you.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start by talking about that public campaign that you're leading, and it's called American Values, Religious Voices, 100 Days, 100 Letters. I've read some of the letters, and I'm hoping that you can share with us a little bit about this campaign, and so our listeners get a sense of how it all came about.
It started out as a fairly harebrained idea that I had walking my dog in the days after the 2016 election. And I thought about the work that I do as a Bible scholar and having just taught a class the Thursday after the election with my students at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, where I talked about how important it was the kind of studies that they're engaged in, studying our sacred texts so that they can draw meaning from them, and particularly at times when people really need guidance and inspirations. I thought to myself, what if we could get 100 scholars of religion who could write to our leaders in Washington, to the new administration, and to articulate what our core American values are and the way that they're connected to our different religious traditions. So that was the origin of this idea of getting a really diverse group of 100 scholars of religion together and using social media and the internet to send these letters out to both to Washington and the wider world for the first 100 days of the Trump administration.
And now that Trump is no longer in office.
Yeah, so we had about 50 days to get the whole project together in 2016, early 2017. We launched on Inauguration Day on January 20th, and we went the 100 days. The letters were later published as a book, and I thought that was done. But as we waited out the election results in November now of 2020, and I just sort of had this sense that people needed these letters now as much as they did in 2017, that we knew, regardless of what the results of the election were going to be, that we have a very divided country. We were struggling through a pandemic, and I just thought to myself, I have a letter I want to write, and I think people could use these letters again.
Maybe tell me a little bit about the letter that you wrote?
Yes, I drew it from Psalm 27. It's a Jewish practice to recite Psalm 27 in the days in the month before the Jewish New Year and then further on through the period of the Jewish high holidays. And that psalm ends with a line that repeats twice, Kaveh el Adonai, to hope for Adonai, and sometimes translated as hope and sometimes as wait. So I had done a lot of thinking and researching in the fall about what it means to hope versus wait. And in that same verse is a line that I translate as cause your heart to be strong and resilient. And so I talked about resilience and I talked about hope. That was a key theme of my letter. In spite of all the challenges that we have, the importance of maintaining hope.
Wow, I think what an amazing distinction to think about, hope versus waiting, and in this moment that we're in, right? What about some of the other voices? Do you have any of the other letters or ones that maybe stood out to you from other faiths?
Sure. Well, I feel like with the 2021 campaign, like I did with the 2017 campaign, like kids, you're not supposed to have favorites.
Of course.
But I will, as a little bit of background, justice was the most prominent theme in 2017, and it will by far be the most prominent theme at the end of the 100 as we kind of do a tally of what themes were most prominent in the letters. I can tell you that justice will be absolutely number one. But what justice means this time is something different than 4 years ago. We have a letter coming up that talks about that it's time to declare anti-Blackness a national emergency. So we've had a number of letters from Black writers, from a number of not only writers of color, but white writers as well, that are really calling out the importance of, recognizing our history of racism and calling upon us to grapple with it.
And what kind of reaction did you receive after the first campaign in 2017?
So a number of people shared with us, because the letters then they came out at 5 a.m. every morning. And so for a lot of people, it's the first thing that they would read every morning. People felt like it was an anchor, like a morning meditation, just really reminding them of the core values. So just to be able to read these letters and to someone to tell you, you're not wrong to think that we should be kind to the stranger. You're not wrong to think that we should love our neighbor, just kind of reaffirming these core values. So that was an important piece of it. Also, people really appreciated, particularly, one as part of the discourse after the 2016 election was the way in which people are siloed. And the letters let people learn from a wide variety of people. So to read other sacred scriptures outside of your own that and particularly to see some of the themes in your own beliefs articulated by other people from other faith traditions. So to read passages from the Quran or Sikh scriptures, Hindu texts, and to it really showed just sort of the diversity and the richness of these various religious faiths, and also the relevance to the issues that we're dealing with now. I'll share one story that I found out early on in the campaign about. It was actually about a quarter of the way in February of the 2017 campaign. And one of our letter writers sent me an email saying that she was at church. It was a Sunday morning. And someone came up to her and said, he's a Democrat living in Manhattan, and he has a brother who's a Republican and a staunch Trump supporter in Oklahoma. And they had stopped talking during the campaign. And he said that they had started talking again because of the letters, that the letters provided a way for them to reconnect and became a source of healing for them. And hearing that early on in the campaign in 2017 really, to me, represented what the potential of the project is, the way that we may disagree on a lot of things, but can we come together around these core values that we do agree on?
Yeah, I got chills when you told that story, because it does seem, even more 4 years later, in light of a very difficult campaign in 2020, and then of course the pandemic and the isolation that so many people are feeling. I can imagine that this is going to be a prominent sort of theme in the reception and how people react this year as well. And what do you think are the unique traits or characteristics that women can bring to these conversations, these types of conversations?
So there are a number of letters in which women who come as religious studies scholars and particularly work on women's issues in their scholarship. So we saw the way in which women were bringing that. So, for example, in a letter a few weeks ago, Amy Easton Flake at BYU, who studies women in Exodus, and part of her research and teaching is on women in the Bible. So she spoke about the midwives and other women in Exodus as showing what crossing entrenched identity divisions look like. Or Karina Hogan, who brought in the Book of Ruth. Most of the letters bring in some type of religious text of some sort. And for our biblical writers, a number of them are drawing upon biblical texts that involve women. So that's sort of one category. And then another one is people bringing their experience as women. So Jackie Hidalgo, whose letter 45, begins her letter, I am exhausted. And her letter is clearly coming from a woman scholar in the midst of a pandemic. Her letter both came very much from her experience as a woman getting through the pandemic, but also she quoted a number of women in her letters. So Fannie Lou Hamer and Chicana author Gloria Anzaldúa. So she brings in women writers. Or a great example is Caroline Lewis, who talks directly about misogyny and patriarchy, which she writes about, and her work is really focused on what she calls the sin of systemic sexism in the church. So those are, authors who are specifically writing about women's issues.
That's great. I want to ask a question. While you were talking, it made me think of something that is kind of a larger point of discussion for this podcast, but more generally, in thinking about amplifying women's voices or bringing women's voices to the table or however we want to phrase it, I'm wondering, is there Is there a particular, I don't know if authenticity is the right word, but what is it that having a woman talk about women in the Bible does that's different than when having a man talk about women in the Bible? That's not an easy question either to think about.
Yeah. Well, one is, I think, just paying attention, right? So noticing and being more attentive to the characters in the Bible. So in Letter 56 by Julie Faith Parker, she shares a story from 2 Kings 5 in which this is really a prophetic story, but she focuses attention on the Israelite. One of the characters in that story is an Israelite girl who's taken captive, and the way in which she's critical to bringing healing in that story and kind of speaking up. And so she's highlighting a character that others might not see as so central in that story. Another good example of that is Angela Parker, who starts her letter explicitly talking about her experience being a divorced mother of two, driving in her minivan with the gas gauge hovering on empty. And then she shares a story from the New Testament about a poor widow who sacrifices to make a donation, and her reading of that text. And that's a good example where she's both focusing on a text that others might not have wanted to pay the same attention to. And you can see the way in which, in that letter in particular, her own personal experience is shaping how she's reading that text.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at is something that is also true when we talk about representation of different racial and ethnic voices as well, too, right? Is being able to be attuned to capture something that just hasn't been covered or discussed or dealt with, right? In some kind of particular way or meaningful way. You know, I've been struck as we've done this podcast now for several months, how diverse people's views of faith are. And we've tended so far to talk mainly to people who are working or studying Christianity and Islam. And even sometimes people I expect to be theologically aligned really aren't sometimes, right? Which is just to say that there is so much diversity around religion in the US. And yet, part of what prompted Elaine and I to start this podcast was that we feel like we only hear from a narrow range of voices, right? And that is especially true in policy debates. And I'm wondering, do you see this happening in public discussions of religion, and particularly Judaism?
Well, I'd say what you just articulated is one of the motivating factors of this project, where especially I think in American, where we see the intersection of religion and politics in the U.S., it's particularly a particular religious voice, this religious right. And it tends to be a monolithic view of religion. And that, I think, is a value of this project. When I was starting it early on, someone said to me, well, I don't really care what so-and-so Bible scholar has to say. I want to know what my rabbi has to say. Well, your rabbi literally has a podium, has a platform to, week in and week out to say what he has to say. But religious studies scholars generally are not on the forefront of our public discussion. And my hunch in starting this project was that we have something to say, and that as scholars, we're not just sitting in the ivory tower, studying these ancient tombs from long ago, but that these texts actually are huge sources and important wells of wisdom for us that relate directly to our contemporary issues. So one of our big fans is, for example, my sister in San Diego, who is certainly not a religious studies scholar. And for her, and has really marveled at the way in which these ancient religious texts speak so powerfully and directly to contemporary issues, so that they, here you have this ancient biblical text and it's so on point to the issues that we're grappling with.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to the moment that we're in, right? And COVID in particular. And one of the elements of Judaism that I've always admired is the way that death is handled, and specifically the many rituals in place to give a space to mourning. And so I wanted to ask you, as a scholar, in light of COVID and the mass deaths that the pandemic has caused, are there any insights you can offer that you can think of in the Torah for how we can think about mourning as a collective during this time?
Yeah, well, I think Judaism, like all our religious traditions, really has a lot to say in that regard. And here, I think I have, like as you just said, really found tremendous comfort and wisdom in the Jewish traditions around mourning, the idea that there's this 7-day period and then a 30-day period, and then the year, the way in which we're sort of guided. And I think about Psalm 23, which is so central to mourning and talks about sort of walking through the valley, and that mourning rituals in Judaism, I think other religions as well, they sort of guide us down into that deep, dark valley of mourning, but also help us get out of the valley, sort of through the rituals, particularly kind of help us emerge from that. And a number of the letters have addressed that as well. One of the things that's been striking to me and a real difference from 2017 is what biblical texts are people drawing upon. And in this campaign, the number of texts that are drawing upon texts like Zechariah or the later parts of the Bible that come from the post-exilic period, which was a period of rebuilding, a period of return, a period where there had been this disruption. And how do you, this on a collective level, how do we begin again?
I mean, what does it mean to be a rabbi to you in this moment?
Well, rabbi really comes from the word teacher. So that's really core to what I do, especially as a Bible professor and as provost at the Hebrew Union College, where I have the opportunity to train rabbis, cantors, Jewish educators to go into the world to help build communities that are centered around meaning, that are helping people, particularly at these moments when they really people need each other. They need the guidance and the insight of our religious traditions. So that's it really means to be a teacher to me.
Well, I love that you say that. So can we take a moment to think about that and put that in conversation with this idea about gender and women in particular in leadership roles and maybe what do you teach? What do you tell aspiring women rabbis about, the future, about the faith, or how to connect religion and gender?
Well, at the Hebrew Union College, we're coming up at the 50th anniversary of the ordination of the first woman rabbi, Rabbi Sally Priesand, in 1972. And one of the unexpected parts of my job has been that I am now the person at HUC who is tasked with physically ordaining our students, and that I have been the first woman rabbi to be in that role. And that's been incredibly powerful, incredibly humbling. And so I physically have an opportunity to ordain all of our students, but that's been meaningful for me, and I know for our students as well. And
yet, if I could maybe push you just for a minute, when you look at the larger picture for your faith and you think about women's leadership in Judaism, what would you like to see change or still happen if you think there's change that needs to happen at a wider level?
Yeah, so I think part of that change is, and what was important about the first women who were ordained as rabbis, is the way in which that opened up that there's not one monolithic view of what a rabbi is. And we are really focused on welcoming, supporting a wide range of students. And so everyone's glorious diversity and everyone's fullness of their identities. So that is the work that we're focused on. The work now is to really kind of expand the embrace beyond just women, but also just sort of trans students, students of color, students of all different identities, and sort of making sure that all of our students sort of that we are helping nurture them in the fullness of their identities so that then they can go out and serve the Jewish people and contribute with all of their gifts most fully.
I love that. That's exciting. It's exciting to hear these stories of change taking place and a broadening of perspectives, right? I mean, another thing I've learned from doing this podcast is, among other things in this last year, is thinking not of things around diversity as an either or, but as an additive approach, right? That it's just bringing more, the more voices we bring, the more we capture the complexities of humanity, right? The more beautiful we make life in general, and public life in particular. I'm curious what you would like to hear more discussions about. As a woman scholar of religion, like what would you like to hear in public discourse more?
Well, I'd love to hear kind of continue this conversation about the way in which we can bring the wisdom from our different religious traditions and how that can make a difference in how we think about solutions to our most pressing problems. So to think about and to really bring a wider religious voice to the public conversation and to appreciate the ways in which our faith is not something sort of, we go to a particular building with a mosque, a church, a synagogue, et cetera, and like that's our religious life. But how can the texts and teachings from our religious traditions help us as a nation collectively as we think, how are we going to solve these really pressing problems that are upon us? That's one of the offerings of this project, is to counter some of those perceptions that religion isn't relevant, that religion isn't, religious communities don't reflect who we are, who we want to be.
I love that. I think that's the perfect note to end on, actually, because it comes full circle to what we talked about in the beginning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
Rabbi
for
Weiss.
having me.
It's been a real pleasure. That's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to, rate, and review us wherever you listen. The Religion and Public Life program is on Twitter at RiceRPLP. Thank you again to our guest, Rabbi Dr. Andrea Weiss. Today's show was written by Rachel Schneider, Haley Hemstreet, and myself. Our producers are Three Wire Creative and Daisha Clay. We had support from the Henry Luce Foundation. I'm Pamela Prickett. Thanks for listening.